Good morning. This is John Bushka again with the Beanie Cap. And today I've got to level with you about something, but let me just show you a few pictures. There's me as a child, probably about 6 or 7 years old. And that's construction near the First Baptist Church in downtown Dallas, Texas. This is 2011. There's the historical landmark, and there's the church itself building, and maybe it's not quite as conservative as it used to be when I was living in Dallas in the 80s. Now probably is a little more moderate, but yeah, I remember Wally Amos Criswell was the pastor in the 80s, and it has an old style building, brick architecture. And we showed the Holy Bible the last time we talked about the parable of the talents, and you could mention the rich young ruler too. But let's get back to just talking about something. Remember in the army or remember in the dorm in college the phrase SIBM, sexual intercourse before marriage. And that was something young men were told not to ever do. And you were also told another rule was don't cheat on tests, don't cheat on homework. Some schools, like William and Mary, which where I first started, had an honor system. Those were kind of the two don'ts. And of course, there was another do that went along with it that I learned the hard way my first semester at William and Mary. And in the screenplay we read, you really were expected to be able to, as a young man, to be able to provide for women and children, defend women and children, possibly go to war to protect them. Women were expected to be ready to bear children if possible. That's when this was the 50s when I was growing up. So everyone had at least heavily emphasized societal expectations of them based on their birth sex. And some of us were not as well off, just what we were born with, than others were. And that was a problem. But those were the expectations. And the expectation was that eventually you would have intercourse, but only after getting married and going through courtship and proving you could provide for a woman, and the wedding ceremony and cutting of the cake and everything, and then that you would be able to consummate the marriage on wedding night. Kind of that was the myth. Of course, a lot of boys wanted to make sure they were ready for it before. And that was kind of how it was. We kind of had a triangular system of morality. It wasn't just what you are not allowed to do, which was have children that you weren't ready to support, whether you were a father, or a woman having allowing someone to have them with you. And of course, I know that gets into the abortion issue today. I'm not going to get into that, but obviously there's an implication in some states. Um, that and you were going to high school, graduating from high school, and going to college, in order to be able to earn more money to provide better for your own family, and to have more power in society and a better station in life. And also in those days to avoid when we had student deferments back in the mid 60s with the Vietnam War. And before then, there had been marriage, or Kennedy had wanted to defer all married men at one point. And then it was married men if you had children. And then I think all that went away and you just had student deferments back around 65 or so. And then finally we had a lottery at the end of 1969. But doing well in school was important to staying out of combat. But the understanding was you would learn to provide for women and children if you were a man. And this was, the civil rights movement was in the mid 60s, 63 on through 65, and into LBJ's presidency. And then the Vietnam War started. And then, of course, Stonewall was for the gay community was in 1969 while I was in the Army. But I was in a system where homosexuality was somewhat unthinkable because it was a distraction from what you were going to be expected to do. And with my parents, I was an only child. So if I didn't have children, their legacy died. And if you remember Sunday school, how important, lineage was, the lineage and the lineages in the Bible that formed the nation of Israel as we have today, all the controversy, Jacob and Esau, where Jacob took it away, and then the tribes, Joseph carrying it on, and Egypt, and then all the tribes, and then Israel splitting into two kingdoms, with Judah being more conservative than Israel itself. I think that all the history, all of it had to do with these patriarchal values and that we learned about in Sunday school when I was growing up at the First Baptist Church downtown at 16th and O, which was not then. It was more liberal than Dr. Pruden and most Southern Baptist churches. Certainly on segregation, it was affiliated with both Southern and American Baptist conventions, but it was not. And I showed you the picture in Dallas of the church in Dallas. It was not, which is Southern. It was not as liberal then as it is now, because that was the way things were, even in the 60s and 70s. But what has to happen, and this, I don't want to be too indelicate as to YouTube's standards and so forth, but what happens, of course, with a young man is you have to become aroused, and I'm not going to get into and the same thing for a female, but with a different biology, of course. But that is an event. We know what that is when it happens. And if you're not able to function the way a young man is supposed to in sports and in being able to fight back in fights, and if you're not as strong as other boys your age are, even before puberty, you're at a disadvantage. You're going to this is going to be a struggle. And we don't know whether my problem was somehow epigenetic. My father was older than usual. If something happened in the womb, because there was a little bit of evidence that I was behind physically in first grade that I found from letters. But it was the third grade teacher who got after me. But it was in the summer after first grade, when we were at Ocean City with that other family. I talk about in that screenplay short. Was that family. I got the measles in 1950. And the measles, as you know, has an effect on neurological integrity of the person for some time after, which might have affected my coordination and ability to play sports. Also makes you sickly for 2 or 3 years afterwards, more sickly, more able to get real sick from other things for 2 or 3 years. And that did happen until I was maybe about 10 or maybe 11 or 12. After about 12 years old, that started becoming less of a problem. And then with puberty, I got somewhat better relative to others. We had a softball game in 11th grade, and I actually pitched a shutout in gym class one time. It was a really big deal. The Senators were in Boston that I still remember that. I was getting better, but I didn't quite catch up. But I was getting closer to norm. But I never got the real spatial or mechanical skills. When I got into the Army, and then in 1968, and that's a long story how that happened, which I'm going to be covering in future, which I covered in my Do As Do Tell show videos. I had wound up in special training because I had to pass the PCTB test, but I did pass it after about 4 weeks. And so if you're non-conforming male, you can get to the point that you can pass. Although there were a couple of people in special training that had been there for 6 months who were overweight and very, very compromised physically and probably should never have been drafted at all. That I met and actually scolded for not being able to pass the test. And that's how it was. But I got through it and wound up in the Pentagon. That's a whole long story. But what happens when you're growing up is that the arousal will become connected in your brain to what excites you will be connected to what you believe transcends your existence, what is going to give you more power. And the most obvious thing is if you have children, and then raise them in a family, properly, you'll get a lot of skin in the game. You'll get a lot of power from that's legitimate, and if you draw attention to yourself for what you accomplish, there'll be some justification because you're supporting a family. But because I wasn't quite competitive enough, and that's another story I'm going to be developing soon, the early 70s when I started my work life, but before I came out a second time. If you're not quite competitive enough, you won't find any point in doing that. And you'll find more point in being affiliated with men that are stronger and more masculine than you are. And you'll get then the possibility, and I don't want to be too indelicate, but the possibility of arousal will become connected to that instead. And so your life may be a series of episodes, or you might find somebody and settle down, and you might today be able to adopt a child and raise a child within a same-sex family, and that might come under question with the influence of the right and the next administration. But you don't get off the expectations that come with your biological sex. Normativity is not necessarily a bad thing. There are a couple of things I wanted to two or three side things I wanted to mention that are particularly important. I am concerned that, for the Project 2025, which mainly hits the transgender issue, but it could hit, gay people just, they want to take away all the protections that having to do with what we call gender except for biological sex, which on the face may be okay for most people. I mean, I didn't have any civil rights protection when I was working. And I stopped my career ended at the end of 2001. I was very stable my whole adult life working with jobs. I had enough skill and stability and passing and so forth that I was okay. People accepted me, but I didn't really need the legal protections. I was used to being without it. But security clearances could be a problem again. I stayed away from, I left NAV Cossack. I was working for the Navy Department in 1971 and 1972 and left and went to UNIVAC. And how that happened is an interesting story that I'll be covering later in future media. But and it's in the story. You do have to tell story videos anyway. But one of the reasons I didn't want to have to deal with top secret security clearances. It wasn't until about 1995 that President Clinton removed all the barriers for gay people to work for the CIA. I think it was 95 or 96. And this was in conjunction with his trying to lift the ban on gays in the military. And of course, in the military, you normally have to have a security clearance as a soldier. Or to have any kind of position at all in the military, you normally have to have a significant security clearance. So that's going to be that could become a problem, depending on if this plays out. Another thing is that in overseas, this is getting worse. In some countries, particularly Russia, there is the idea that if people are allowed to talk about not only transgenderism, but even homosexuality as we're used to it, publicly on the internet or in public places, that young men will lose interest in marriage and having children, and the birth rate will continue to squander. That's particularly a concern in Russia, where there's now a law that you can't discuss the child-free lifestyle in public in Russia. I understand that a law like that was passed. And then anti-gay propaganda laws, we know that was one passed in 2013 in Russia, and that was that was before the Winter Olympics in 2014, remember, in Sochi. But then remember what happened, it was a few years later that 8 years later, it was right then that Russia invaded Crimea about a year later. So that was a bad sign. And then we know what happened in 2022 is that Russia invaded all of Ukraine, or the eastern part particularly. And we know what's happened. Then Putin complains about the internet that Western values are affecting his people. So And people use VPN to get around the blocks and everything. And same is true in China, where a lot of material is blocked if you're in China, but you can get around it with VPNs. And so that is something that could even affect treaties, companies being willing to end wars. It sounds conceivable that could happen. So that's something I've been very concerned about and watching. Um, the the the, the no, yeah, norms. The norms. Another thing is that as I got older, I got better at stuff, the masculine stuff. I got reasonably good at taking care of my gear and weapons and everything in the military. But I lost a lot of that skill after I started getting sort of sloppy again. After I got out of and entered civilian life, and over time, I lost some of that sort of more better skill that I had. Um, the norm. Oh, I know the other thing. One other thing I wanted to mention. There are some videos out there of people claiming near-death experiences who were openly gay, and they claim that in with these going into these other dimensions where heaven or the afterlife supposedly exists in maybe other dimensions beside the four we have. There are 11 dimensions, and they meet relatives. Most of the people that they encounter are extended family members who had children and were very involved in the family. And they're told that they did something wrong by living a gay life, that they should have obeyed God and so forth. And I think what's really happening is that, when people, there's several of these videos online. It might be propaganda. You can look for them yourself. In some cases, people have broken up gay marriages after near-death experiences like this. But I think the thing is, there is a perception in many parts of the world that if you don't do your part and have have a family, and have children yourself and raise them, that you're cheating the system. That's an important part of adulthood. That's an important responsibility. And the way that you have to be able to consummate a marriage, of course. So this again is the triangular morality. You actually have to be able to do it. So you have to have the skills appropriate to your biological sex to be able to do that well. You have to be able to grow up and be competitive. That's just how it is. If you're not, then somebody has to take care of you. You're hurting your tribe, is what they think. And then, in some Muslim societies, women have to keep their faces covered because that's to make inside marriage women more attractive to men, so that men will remain more interested in their marriages. Apparently, is a reason for those religious rules in some cultures. So it's very important to do your part in actually providing a family. If you can't do your part, then you stay home within the family in many cultures, like indigenous cultures, and perform either as a caregiver, if you're a nurturing person, or maybe as another warrior who just doesn't have his own children. But you're not allowed the freedom to go out and have your own agency in your own life. Agency is a big thing with me. Your own ability to have your own life. Normally, having your own family gives you a lot of agency. And if you don't have your own family, in some cultures, your right to your own agency could be compromised. So that's really a very big deal. But I think the other thing is, if you are successful living outside the norms of having a family, which many people are, and it's been increasing with hyper individualism, and with people particularly since the 90s, I think it's been very acceptable for a lot of people not to marry and have children, and fewer people want children now, and we all know that's a birth rate problem. But there is a perception you're letting somebody else carry the weight. You're leaving that for somebody else. There ought to be an implicit responsibility for future generations. that we all ought to be assessed. And that gives us a climate change issue, and probably of how much we use ourselves ought to be controlled. So either you do that the way the left wants to by pushing people into groups, and then some groups are oppressors and some groups are oppressed. So the left wants to drive everybody, including gays, back into an oppressed group so they can claim their rights because they can't really defend this on an individual level anymore. That's what seems to be going on. The oppressor versus oppressed, or if you don't have a communal society, like, essentially communism, go back to Romeoism or communism, where everybody shares manual labor and where nobody has private property anymore. Carlin Borisenko has been talking about that a lot on her channel, the extreme radical left, the plans that it might have. People don't even have their own kitchens in an extreme communal life because it's all common. So that's how you take care of those based on need, those who have the ability based on provide for those based on need in a communal setting. But the only other way to do that is that people stay with their original families or tribes of origin and stay home, which is what happened in my family, particularly on the mother's side, because several people didn't have any children at all. One relative had 3 children. My mother had only 1, and then another brother had only 1, and one had 3. And I think that's all. And then another one married late in life. 2 more of them married late in life, but didn't have any children. But they tended to stay home. In fact, lived in that same house in Kipton, some of them for a long time near Oberlin. So that's how the matriarchal side of my family was. And I was used to that in the 1950s when I was growing up, going to Cleveland Indians baseball games on the lake because the Indians were a lot better than the Senators then. I still remember that. But that's what it was. Summers in Ohio and your school year in the DC area in Arlington, going near Washington, going to one of the best high school systems in the country. But the values were very set, and the stability of it was very reassuring to me. Again, I wanted to be affiliated with the best examples of men who had both the brains and the brawn. It wasn't brains or brawn or street smarts or book smarts. You had to have both. You had to have both brains and brawn. You had to have both street smarts and book smarts. That's something that came out in a short subject I wrote about, an expulsion that I wrote about my William and Mary expulsion. So I just wanted to lay this out for you this morning. This is a really serious thing that we're going to have to deal with. I don't know how far the right is going to go during this mere expression. Not Trump himself so much, but some of the other people that might be. I think it was Hegseth was thinking about ending the military ban, and was thinking about returning not only taking transgender out of the military, but going back to the military ban, even asking, I guess, before don't ask, don't tell. But then he kind of walked it back, according to another CNN story, or I think it was a Politico story. You can check that. So I don't know where that stands and what's going to happen to gays in the military with the new administration. That's something I'm watching and I'm concerned about. And how that might affect security clearances, again, is something we got to pay attention, and how it might affect even international relations with the stuff we put on the internet and that others can find could become an issue. So I just wanted to talk to you very candidly about this morning. And I do thank you for listening.